hello to everyone in the audience. I will talk about a problem-based learning exercise that I designed for one of the courses I teach at the integrated undergraduate and graduate program of study in conservation restoration at the Arts Academy in Split, which is where I work. So this was a preventive conservation course that students took in the second year, and the assignment was intended to familiarize them with the concept of risk assessment. On this slide, you can see the students who participated in the assignment. There were 10 of them. That's how many students we accept in our program each year. These students had already completed a course on the basics of preventive conservation, which I teach in the first year of the program. And as a part of that introductory preventive conservation course, this specific group of students attended a lecture by a visiting expert, José Luis Pedersoli Jr. of ICROM, co-author of the ABC method. So they had already heard something about risk management. The assignment that I devised for them focused on real heritage objects. I actually used 3 sculptures from the Sisak Steelworks Sculpture Park. So this is a collection of 38 outdoor metal sculptures in Sisak. The sculptures were produced in the 1970s and 1980s, and they were produced by the artists from the former Yugoslavia. The collection was inscribed in the Register of Cultural Property of the Republic of Croatia in 2012. And since 2012, I have been involved in the study and preservation of this collection. The first sculpture I selected was The Work Process by Saša Stevović. The sculpture is made of steel. It rests on a low cement plinth and is sited near a road that connects the former Sisak Steelworks and the nearby housing estate. The second sculpture was Dark Visions 1 by Josip Zeman. This sculpture is made of galvanized steel, and it is installed in the middle of the park that separates the factory from the nearby housing estate. This sculpture lies directly on the ground. The third object was a painted steel sculpture, Wall, by Dora Kovačević. This sculpture is located in the Steelworks housing estate. It is not properly installed, rather leant against a wall of a residential building. And as you can see, the 3 sculptures differ in material, in size, form, and location. Now, I need to point out that the students had not seen the sculptures in person. I provided them with some photographs. I pointed them to Google Map on which their locations are marked. So the students were not required to consider the physical condition of the objects when working on this assignment. And now let's see what students had to do. I initially asked them to produce an essay in which they were to explain what threats is each sculpture exposed to, how can damage occur, what measures can be taken to prevent the damage, which people and or services can help implement the proposed measures. And in addition to that, I asked them to explain who should respond when a sculpture gets damaged and what the chain of responsibility should be. Now, the essays that students submitted varied in quality. Going through their texts, I could see most students did not approach the problem systematically. They did not take into account all the threats that sculptures are exposed to and all the possible incident scenarios related to those threats. And when considering individuals and services that could be involved in the implementation of the measures they proposed to mitigate some of these threats, most students mentioned only conservatory restorers. And I was of the opinion that a better result could be achieved if we tackled this issue gradually, and also if I provided more guidelines to the students. So first I asked them to read each other's essays and to critically evaluate their own work. Then I asked them to write incident scenarios for the 10 agents of deterioration for just one sculpture. So I assigned each student one sculpture. And they had to write these incident scenarios, but actually they were required to extract the scenarios from the essays they had written previously. And the text from the essays had to be amended so that it provides a thorough explanation of the sequence of events and how the resulting damage is manifested. And in the bottom left corner of this slide, you can see a correction example. And to make sure that I did this in a systematic way, I provided them with a form in which they had to enter all this information, so all these incident scenarios for all 10 agents of deterioration for one sculpture. And I also provided them with some examples. In the end, I collected and reviewed all the forms. And from this material, I extracted 78 different incident scenarios. On this slide, you can see how they were distributed across the 10 agents of deterioration. So for example, there were 16 different incident scenarios related to physical forces, 6 related to fire, etc. We then moved on to the final step of the assignment. I asked the students to A, propose mitigation measures for each of the 78 scenarios, and B, to consider which individuals and or institutions can help implement the proposed measures. Now, I want to give you a glimpse of the results of this enormous work, and so I will focus on the second and the third step of the assignment. And I will use this sculpture, the one sited near a road, and physical forces as an example. So let's see how this particular object can suffer damage from physical forces. Students managed to identify 7 incident scenarios, and I will now show you these scenarios. So for example, if someone is driving too fast or under the influence, a car can fly off the road, hit the sculpture and physically damage it. And the force of the impact can also cause the sculpture to fall off the concrete plinth. Next, gravel or other rock material can fall off passing trucks, and the cars can propel the gravel or rocks toward the sculpture. This can again lead to surface damage. During grass cutting, a mower or a trimmer can propel gravel or small rocks toward the sculpture, again leading to surface damage. Due to road traffic, the sculpture is subject to vibration, noted my students. This can expose the material to strain and lead to micro-cracking. Solid particles carried by the wind can abrade the surface of the sculpture. A strong wind or a storm can break off a branch from a nearby tree, which can land on the sculpture and cause scratches on its surface. And finally, a lightning strike can locally melt the surface, deform the sculpture, or even completely destroy it. Now, obviously, some of these incident scenarios can be applied to the other 2 sculptures, the one installed in the park and the one located in the housing estate. But these sculptures might exhibit different types of damage because they are made of different materials and are different in size and form. And it's also important to keep in mind that the other 2 sculptures have incident scenarios that are specific to them. That is why I said that students came up with a total of 16 different scenarios related to physical forces, and I have only showed you 7 in the previous slides. After all these different incident scenarios were identified, the next step was to propose mitigation measures and to determine who could implement them. And let's take this incident scenario as an example. If someone is driving too fast or under an influence, a car can fly off the road, hit the sculpture and damage it, or even cause the sculpture to fall off the concrete plinth. So the first question is, what actions or measures can be undertaken to mitigate this damage? Now, as far as I can tell, there are 2 lines of action. We can, 1, slow down motor vehicle traffic, or B, we can try to minimize impact damage or impact force, to be more precise. How can vehicle speeds be reduced? Well, here are some options. We can install speed limit signs, speed humps, speed cameras, or periodically conduct speed controls. What about impact damage? How can it be minimized? Again, there are several options. The sculpture can be moved away farther from the road. And one way of doing this is by switching the position of the footway and of the green surface on which the sculpture is installed. But this intervention would impact pedestrian safety. Other options are to install a fence along the road or to install a sculpture on a higher cement plinth. But these 2 interventions could have negative effect on the visual experience of the artwork, and it's something that needs to be borne in mind. Now, my second question was, who do we need to collaborate with in order to implement these measures and actions? And just to remind you, here is the list of the proposed mitigation measures. So let's start by seeing who is in charge of motor vehicle traffic. Well, obviously, road authorities and the police force. And who could be involved in impact damage mitigation? Again, road authorities, but also municipal planning service if reinstallation of the sculpture is needed. But also, I think that we should ask or seek the artist's approval for the proposed moving of the sculpture or the increase in the plinth height. And I will not go further into this. I will just say that each of the 78 scenarios was elaborated in the same manner. And I covered 3 scenarios to provide students with an example of how this should be done. And then they, working individually, covered 75 scenarios. So each student had to cover all 75 scenarios. Now, In this assignment, students were not asked to determine if the sculpture installed near a road has a bigger chance of being hit by a car or being damaged by a fallen tree, and which of the two events would result in greater damage or greater loss of value. Those kinds of estimates would require far more data and much more time. So what students did through this assignment was not a risk assessment. If they had done risk assessment, they would have been able to prioritize mitigation measures. Still, this exercise managed to familiarize them with the concept of risk assessment. The assignment as a whole made the students rethink and expand their perception of preventive conservation. And I'm sharing here with you an excerpt from a 2016 interview with Stefan Michalski of the Canadian Conservation Institute, in which the interviewer notes that traditionally conservators and all the recommendations regarding preventive conservation were focused on relative humidity and temperature, and Stefan Michalski confirms this. And probably this was also an image that my students had. But after this exercise, their concept, their view of preventive conservation dramatically changed. I think that the most important lesson my students learned was that heritage objects are exposed to an extremely wide range of threats. And when we design a preventive conservation plan, we need to take this into consideration. Another takeaway point was that when it comes to implementation of risk mitigation measures, conservative restorers don't have to be like a Swiss knife. We cannot do all the work on our own. What we need to do is identify potential partners and establish collaboration with them. Did the Sisak sculptures benefit from this assignment? Of course they did. The threats to the 3 sculptures were recognized, mitigation recommendations developed, and key actors identified. These data can be used to create a preventive conservation plan, not just for these 3 sculptures, but for other similar works in this collection and elsewhere. If more sculptures from this collection are analyzed in this way, a catalog of different incident scenarios and mitigation recommendations can be produced. And in future, more factors that determine an object's vulnerability to damage could be included. And as a final result, I dare imagine a database in which one could enter sculpture's attributes, for example, painted steel, urban area, under a tree, and a list of all incident scenarios would be shown along with possible mitigation measures. It would be, I think, an extremely helpful tool in preventive conservation planning. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them or you can email me. Thank you.